Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to install some LEDs in the rear clusters and fit a full width mud flap. Right now we have the stock mud flaps, which look just fine, but I wanted a black set to fit the low loader trailer, which currently has a white set. So rather than finding a black set on eBay, I got a mono flap from AliExpress. It's got some nice Scania logos, other brands are also available, and it comes with some metal mounting hardware to support the centre section. If you search for Tamiya rubber fender, they should come up. There's a few sellers, so I don't really want to directly link to just one. If we take all the bits out of the bag, we can see the flap has a nice matte finish on the outside, but oddly it's glossy on the inside. Not that that really matters, of course. The metal brackets feel like steel. They're quite heavy, so should be more than tough enough. Also, there's an etched maker's name, Kea, plus something I can't quite make out. Quality-wise, it all looks pretty good. Not Tamiya good, but I'm sure once fitted it'll all do the job quite nicely. Also in the bag are some tiny screws and nuts for the centre section of the flap. The end of the mud flap just uses the Tamiya fixings. Step 1 then is to remove the lights from the rear of the arches. There's a couple of screws on the inside, the two on the bracket that attaches them to the chassis, and there's a screw hidden underneath the number plate. With them removed, we have all the bits free from the chassis and ready to work on. Each side has another two screws that attach the metal bracket to the plastic and hold the mud flap in place. After we remove them, we can separate the parts and peel off the flap. It's been there for a little while, so it's a little bit stuck. Do both, and that's all the bits ready for the new parts. Okay, let's look at the LEDs. On the back of the cluster are some holes for LEDs. If we have a look at the manual for the truck, it shows us what goes where. From the outside we have the winker or indicator, so that's a 5mm yellow. Then we have the tail light, which is a 5mm red. Next is the reverse light, a 3mm white, and right on the inside is another spot for a 3mm LED. I'm guessing this might be for a fog light, which of course the Tamiya MFC doesn't have an output for. So after a bit of soldering, we have the LEDs fitted. Remember, we're not using an MFC, so the wiring is a little bit different. The clusters are wired as a common anode array. That means the anodes, or I suppose the positive legs, are all connected together and run down the red wire. Then for the cathodes, or negative leg, we have the yellow for the indicator, brown for the tail light, and white for the reverse light. To drive them, the red wire connects to a voltage source, 5 volts for example. Then if we connect one of the cathodes to ground, the LED will light up. You need something to limit the current, of course, like a resistor in each of the cathode lines, but these will be connected to some electronics that does it a bit differently. So in this install, we're not going to have millions of resistors. Now, before installing, I'll stick a couple of layers of Kapton tape to make sure the LEDs are insulated from the metal bracket. Otherwise, with vibration, something might just find its way to a short. Okay, metal bracket next, and we need to clip the bits that attach the parts to the surround. Then with a small file, tidy them up. It just takes a couple of passes just to smooth out any sharp edges. Unfortunately, you don't get any printed instructions, but they are on the product page. So step 1 is to bend the centre support of the flap 90 degrees, which is easier said than done. Certainly not as easy as the Lisu parts. Doing it by hand just isn't going to work. Pliers are okay, but you do need to take care that the bend is even along the line. The best bet would be to use a small vise to clamp the part, then bend it in one go. Next, the side tabs need bending up, and these are far easier as they fit within the width of the jaws, but still we need to take care to get them nice and even. Right, to assemble, we need to attach the clusters to the mud flap. Just like the stock flap, they fit over the plastic nubs, and we add the bracket and install the two screws. Now the first one is easy, but doing the second one is a little bit awkward with the weight of the first one hanging on the end. The wires make it a bit worse too, but the parts do fit, so as long as we don't rush into things, it'll work out just fine. For now, the screws have the slack taken out of them, and once everything's together, we'll go around and tighten them up properly. Same goes for all the other ones too. With the light clusters balanced on the arches, we can work out how to fit the bracket. Now the flange with the holes to support the flap needs to be on the inside, which is okay, but we need to hold it there while we get the clusters in position and reinstall the self-tappers through the bracket, through the flat mount and into the plastic cross member on the chassis. Now I spent quite a while trying to get it all balanced in just the right spot, but more often than not the flat mount would just fall out. Part of the problem was trying to do it so you guys can see what's going on too. In the end, I just stopped recording and got the first screw in a few turns without having to worry about blocking the view, which was far easier. Next we have the stock aluminium tube. It's fitted with the 2 Allen head screws, but again getting it to line up was a bit of a pain and I ended up blocking the camera. The trick is, with the new flat mount, access is partially blocked, so getting it to line up is a bit tricky. Not impossible though, and once one side was threaded in, the other side was fairly easy. Next, with the chassis flipped over, we can reinstall the M3x6s and the plain nuts. Remember, all the screws are a little bit loose, so we can jiggle the parts to get the holes to line up. The new flat mount pushes the clusters out just a little, but it's enough that you do have to wiggle to get the screws to go in. The last 2 screws are the small self-tappers that go into the posts next to the LEDs. Access is a pain if, like me, you made the arches one piece by welding them together. If you haven't, you could remove the rearmost section and then refit it, but with those tiny screws it might still be easier just to do them in situ, if you have the right tool. I'm using a mini electric driver and a flexible drive to get the driver bit straight onto the screw and do them up. One of those tools you'll probably rarely use, but when it's useful, it's really useful. Next, we can add the screws and nuts for the flap center support. The plan is to sandwich the rubber flap between the mount on the chassis and the strip. We start by popping a screw into the end hole of the strip and slotting in a suitable driver into the screw head. Then we pop it through the hole in the rubber and wiggle it until it pops through the mount. Then at the other end we add another screw. That should line everything up fairly well, so we can add a nut to those 2 screws, just taking up the slack. Next we do the same with the middle 3 holes, so that's 3 screws and 3 nuts. Once they're all in, that's all the bits together, so we can go around and tighten up all the screws. The only ones to watch out for are the 5 we just installed. If we do them up too tight, the metal strip will bow and look pretty awful. So we just want to take up the slack plus a little bit extra. To stop them from falling out, we can use a little bit of thread lock or an odorless sino, which will also do the trick. Just a tiny amount on the threads. Once all the screws are done up, we can refit the wheels and flip the chassis over. Okay, next we need to run those wires somewhere useful. When we built the chassis, we drilled holes in the sides of the cross members for the wiring. So all we need to do is make them look tidy and run the wires through the holes. With the coupler removed, we can just about see what we're doing. We just need a bit more heat shrink to keep the wires together. We need to get all the ends together and run them through a bit of heat shrink the right lengths to get us right up to the gearbox. After a bit of pulling and pushing, we have it in just the right spot, so we have a Y layout with the 2 clusters breaking off to each side. After a bit of heat, and being very careful not to cook any of the paint, we have a neat cable ready to stuff in through all the holes. To make it easy, we're going to tape up the loose ends of the wires so they all stay together. Then we just run them through the holes up to the gearbox. I ended up removing the coupler lever plate too, just for a bit more access. Otherwise, that's about it. The wires will end up being terminated with a connector and plugging into a board in the box to the right of the chassis. This will deal with all the chassis lighting. For now, I'll just loop the wires up and tuck them out of the way. When we do the left-hand running lights, all the wires will come together and run across to the box. With the coupler and lever plate back on, it's looking nice and tidy. We just need a couple of wire clips to keep the rearmost portions away from the axles. I have some that will fit perfectly, but the foam tape that they have has long since fallen to bits, so I'll have to find some suitable glue to stick them inside the chassis rails, but I'll sort that out off camera. So here we go, one mono flap installed. I think it suits the truck far better than the two smaller flaps, especially with the logos, although I think the silver strip at the top of the flap really should be black, so that might get a coat of paint. Otherwise, it's a nice upgrade. It all fitted fine, so can't complain really. Right, that's it for this week then. So as always, thanks for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys.